My son shouted, "Go to a nursing home. Get out of my house." The words cut clean through the warm, familiar air of the living room I had called home for 47 years. They struck the floral wallpaper, the worn velvet armchair, even the grandfather clock that had ticked patient witness to birthdays and winter colds and Sunday soups, and they stayed there, like knives lodged in wood. Cole's face was a hard mask I didn't recognize. His fists were balled at his sides, his posture stiff with a righteousness that didn't belong to the boy I had raised to cup fireflies in both hands and set them free. Just over his shoulder, Victoria hovered with the stillness of a poised blade. She didn't look angry. Anger would have been human. She looked satisfied. The tiniest smile, quick as a cat's blink, flickered at the corner of her mouth as she watched me absorb the blow. Behind my ankles, a trembling bundle of gray fur tried to disappear into the hem of my skirt. The kitten, soaked from the drizzle, ribs like fingers beneath a dull coat, had been crying from the hedges by the curb when I found him. I had done what kindness insists upon, wrapped him in a towel still warm from the dryer, given him a saucer of milk, and tucked him where the furnace's hum could keep him from shaking. For me, that felt like breathing. For Victoria, it was a final offense in a ledger she'd kept with meticulous, silent contempt. "This is a zoo," she had said earlier, her voice so sharp it could have filleted a fish. "Your mother is turning our beautiful home into a flophouse for diseased animals, Cole. It smells. It's unsanitary. It's embarrassing. You have to choose. It's me or them." I had stood at the sink, fingers aching with dishwater, while Cole absorbed her words without looking at me. There was a small pause, a moment when a different son could have existed, and then the verdict, the sentence shouted into the living room that used to be mine. He chose her. A soundless space opened in the moment after he yelled. The house emptied of warmth and a heartbeat, as if someone had opened a door in winter and left it yawning. I stared at my son and looked for the child who had once pressed daisy crowns into my hair and promised to build me a castle out of cardboard boxes. I saw only a stranger wearing my son's eyes, their light refitted with a colder purpose. This house, my house, had not been in my name for a long time. That was a fact with a history, and the history belonged to Bruce and me. When we came west from Virginia, we came with foolishness and a beat-up station wagon and the idea that California air could cure an old ache we didn't know how to name. We left our people behind, not because they were cruel, but because we wanted to start something that belonged to no one but us. "If we go," Bruce had said, "we can be just us. We can be our own gravity." We bought this lot with a view of the foothills and lived for 2 years in a tin-roofed construction and sunshine, hammering and laughing, learning how cedar smells when it surrenders to a plane. We built a house someone else might call modest, but to me was cathedral. The kitchen was mine. The big window over the sink was mine. The nail in the hallway wall where Cole's kindergarten painting hung crooked was mine. Cole was our only child. I carried him late and worried and too careful. He arrived with a sleepy personality and a mop of hair that never obeyed water or combs. He was the greatest sweetness God let me taste. So I built my days around him, the way a planet falls obediently into orbit around a star. Later, I would wonder if the orbit had been too tight. Bruce was good with his hands and better with a straight face when mischief was the only medicine. He could fix anything mechanical and most things broken in the heart. He was also, in his worst honesty, superstitious about institutions. The IRS sat at the end of that fear like a dragon. "I don't trust a government that pretends it understands the value of what a man builds with his hands," he'd say, not angry, just stubborn. In those years, before we knew what we didn't know, he decided a particular trick would keep us safer. He came home one afternoon, cheeks red from the wind, and said, "Miranda, we're going to move the title of the house into Cole's name. He's the future. Keeps eyes off us. Keeps probate away. We don't need some suit crawling over our cupboards when I'm gone." I didn't argue, not because I thought it wise, but because my trust in him was bone deep. We didn't go to a lawyer. We signed what the county clerk would take. We believed we were securing something for our son. We never imagined we were securing a blade he might one day lift against me. Bruce died 15 years ago. The quiet after him was not the kind that heals, it was a quiet that rang. For a long time, I didn't cook anything that made the house smell like Sunday. The first time I made stew again, I cried over onions. I filled the emptiness with small lives that needed me. The lame beagle from the shelter, who wouldn't let anyone but me touch his ears. The one-eyed tabby that laughed in the sun. Later, the canary with the broken wing that healed wrong but sang like a bell anyway. I kept things clean. I kept vet records. I used a mop and diluted bleach and lined baskets with new towels. I told myself it was stewardship. I told myself I was still useful. Victoria believed none of it. Before she lived here, she visited like a curious rich niece who found the old and smell amusing. After she moved in, she set about stripping the place of what felt too alive. "Catherine," she'd say, refusing to call me Mom, "these quilts are too busy. The living room needs to breathe." The quilts went into a cedar chest. The kitchen needs a pallet. The spice rack disappeared. The cat beds were corralled to a corner. Then to the laundry room. Then, she suggested, outside, where pets belong. Cole followed her taste with the faith of a convert. When she said the armchair made the room feel heavy, he put it in the garage. When she wrinkled her nose at the smell of sawdust on my apron, he told me maybe I should pause the little projects. When she said the beagle's nails clicked too much on the wood floor, he bought booties that the dog hated and called it compromise. I should have seen where it was going. Perhaps I did, and didn't want to know. The day the kitten found me, the sky had that steady gray that makes everything look like a memory. I heard his crying before I saw him, thinner than a flute and more urgent. He burrowed deeper into the wet leaves when I tried to lift him, then gave up like a child who runs out of tantrum.
He fit in my 2 hands.
I could feel his heart like a wing trapped in a pocket. I wrapped him in a towel still warm from the dryer. I warmed milk. I told him we would talk to the vet tomorrow and find out whose he had been and whether he had a future. He purred in shocked relief when his belly stopped hurting. Victoria came home to the sound of a kitten drinking. She set her toad on the counter like a judge sets a file on a bench.
"No," she said.
"Absolutely not. This is the last straw." Cole came when she called his name the way she might call a well-trained dog. "It's unsanitary," she told him. "It's the smell. My friends don't want to come over anymore. People talk. This is humiliating." I started to say something about quarantine and vet checks and how the kitten wasn't near the carpet, but Cole didn't look at me. He had that glazed focus of a man who'd been told the road to peace required the sacrifice of one thing. "Mom," he said, voice flat as a door, "Victoria's right. You've got to stop bringing animals here. You're not well. You're not thinking straight. The house is mine, and I'm responsible for its condition. Please." He glanced at Victoria, as if collecting courage from her stare. "Either go to a nursing home where they can help you or get out." He shouted the last 2 words when I didn't move fast enough. In his mouth, "get out" sounded like a broom sweeping crumbs. I didn't scream back. The truth is, I felt very old all at once, as if my bones remembered something my mind had been too generous to see. I looked at the photograph on the mantle of Bruce with sawdust in his hair and a grin that tried to convince you the world, while sometimes cruel, could be tamed. That was the last moment I was a mother in that house. After that, I was simply a body to be removed. What came next did not require legalities or kindness. Victoria had prepared far more than her perfume and her arguments. She had already toured facilities. She had already called one. She had already confirmed an address and a monthly fee and the availability of a trial period. She had already arranged transportation. She had already decided I would go. She did not need a court order, because she had something more efficient, my numb consent. When you are stunned, you can be maneuvered like furniture. She took money from my savings to make it easier, because in her mind ease is a virtue even when it's cruelty. She grabbed one suitcase and filled it with what she approved a woman should have. Comb, slacks, 3 sweaters that did not clash with beige, The photo albums were too heavy, the cedar chest key was misplaced, my work apron was stained, but she packed the tweed blazer she thought made me look presentable. I stood near the furnace vent, listening to the tiny engine of the kitten's purr throbbing against my palm. "Please," I said to no one in particular. I don't know which mercy I was begging, perhaps the small mercy that someone would see me. No one did. The door I had painted during a summer of freckles and iced tea closed behind me. The rain that had softened to mist soaked my hair anyway. The driveway looked longer than I remembered, maybe because people forget the distance when they build it and only measure when they walk it away. The nursing home was beige by design. Beige walls, beige chairs, beige conversations delivered in the careful cadence of staff with too many rooms and not enough hours. They admitted me the way a hotel admits guests, polite but tired. They put a clipboard in my hands and turned the pages with a finger, letting me sign where the post-its bloomed. I signed. I did not read. It is an odd thing to consent to your own disappearance. My roommate, Eleanor, spoke to people who were not in the room. She had the most beautiful hands, soft as petals when she touched the windowsill, as if the glass might be bruised. Once, she reached for the air and said, "Hush now, he's sleeping," and I wanted to tell her I knew exactly who she meant. I hid the kitten the way a child hides the last candy. In my handbag at first, then in a nest fashioned from 2 sweaters under the bed. The nurses knew. Of course they knew. People who work in places like that see all the human contraband: cookies, radios, unsent letters, grief. None of them touched him. One of them, a woman with gray braids and soft shoes, slipped me 2 packets of cream and said nothing at all. He learned my heartbeat and I learned his confidence. I named him Jasper because there is a stone that takes polish like light, and I wanted the name of something that becomes more itself when it endures. A week is a long time in a place designed to measure the end. Breakfast is scheduled kindness. Lunch is surrender to routine. Dinner is the slow courage required to sleep when you don't know if you want morning. I walked the corridors in soft socks and learned the names on door plates. I learned the nurse's cart squeaks more when the floor is clean. I learned that a kettle can whistle even when you don't hear it if you've stopped listening for steam. People imagine that when your child throws you away, you wail. Mostly, you sit very still because motion suggests hope, and hope is what betrayed you. I thought of Cole's first skin knee, the frog house we built under the rhododendrons, the night terrors that ended when I put my hand on his chest and told the monsters I was larger. I thought of the day Bruce taught him to set a nail without bending it, and how Cole jumped around the driveway like a boy who'd been released from gravity. I thought of every small goodness, and then I thought, like a physician probing a bruise despite compassion, about the last sentence he had said to me. "Go to a nursing home. Get out." The words were an echo that wouldn't die in the wallpaper of my mind. I had no one to call. That had been our choice long ago, when the road west swallowed the last mailbox with our family name on it. There were no sisters for me. No cousins who remembered the smell of my mother's kitchen. Bruce had been my beginning and, in too many ways, I had let him become my end. I had built my life like a cloche over one plant. When the cloche broke, I did not know whether. So I waited, not for rescue, because I am old enough to know stories that require nights usually end in burning. I waited for the floor of feeling to stop dropping away. The rain returned on a Tuesday, the way it had a habit of doing in the shoulder seasons. I watched it trace crooked pencil lines down the glass. Jasper slept in his sweater cave, a comma of fur at the edge of my attention. A nurse knocked. "Miss Gardner, you have a visitor." A visitor. The phrase felt antique in my mouth when I repeated it. My heart did a small, foolish thing. Not hope. Curiosity with a bruise. I imagined Cole in the hallway, flanked by Victoria in expensive sorrow, rehearsed concern positioned at the corners of their lips like stage makeup. I taught my face to be blank for the performance. I tucked Jasper deeper under the bed, and when he mewed complaint, I tapped the floor once. Our code for quiet. The door opened. It was not my son. "Miranda," the man said, with a voice that knew my name the way it knew my seasons. My God. Albert Dempsey, looked older in the way good men do, more lines, more kindness. He had been Bruce's closest friend in the early days, back when they believed sweat could beat statistics. They worked side by side in a garage that smelled like possibility. We had drifted apart the way rivers do when a ridge pushes them in different directions. Decades lay between us like a plane. He stopped just inside the threshold and took the whole beige of the room into his eyes. He saw what the place did to color. He saw me. I knew because his mouth did that soft twist grief gives to men who have loved their friends. "What are you doing in a place like this?" he asked, not accusing me, but accusing the world. The dam inside me, carefully mortared for a week, gave. I told him everything. The animals, the kitten, Victoria's contempt dressed as taste, Cole's sentence, Bruce's earlier trick with the deed that had put a knife in our future by trying to shield it, the suitcase, the rain, the beige. He listened the way you hold a wounded bird, enough firmness that it doesn't fall, enough gentleness that it doesn't break further. He didn't interrupt, except to ask once, with fury suppressed in courtesy. He said what? When I told him the exact words, he closed his eyes for a second as if adjusting to a pain that didn't belong to his body. When I finished, the room went very quiet except for the tired tick of the radiator. He reached across the space, set his hand over mine, and let the weight of his palm convince me I had not evaporated. "You're not staying here," he said. The sentence was not up for debate. "Pack your things." "I don't have things," I answered, surprising myself with the accuracy. The suitcase on the chair looked very much like something that belonged to a prop department. He glanced at the suitcase and then at me as if the difference between the two wounded him. "Then we'll get things later," he said. "But first we leave." "Albert," I began, because pride is sometimes the only valuable you have left. "I don't want to be a burden." "Miranda," he didn't let me finish. "Bruce would haunt me if I left you here. And if he wouldn't, I would haunt myself." There was no paperwork to wrestle with beyond what the front desk required when a woman decides to reclaim her name. A signature to confirm liability. A caretaking plan that said, in polite words, she will not be our responsibility anymore. The nurse with the gray braids watched me put Jasper into the handbag with the kind of professional blindness that is the last rebellion left to the kind. Albert's car smelled like dust and pine. He drove the way men do when they remember they are still responsible for one more thing. I watched the rain unspool behind us on the windshield. Cities have a way of looking the same from long hallways and from car windows. Blurred, busy, full of the life that forgets you when you sit down. Albert's house was not grand, but it was made of decisions. Books that had been read. A chair that clearly still had a favorite occupant. A wool blanket someone had used last night and folded without the need to make it soldier perfect. He had a shelf of photographs that contained my husband in 3 sizes of smile. The sight of Bruce's face on someone else's wall struck me with a tenderness I had not allowed myself. My knees weakened. Albert pretended not to notice, which is an old friend's greatest skill. "Guest room is down the hall," he said. "Clean sheets. Window looks at the back garden. Heavier quilt in the closet if the night turns mean." It was the language of hospitality that knows what the body still needs to believe in. I placed Jasper on the bed, and he made circles like a tiny planet testing its orbit. He fell asleep in the hollow my hip would later make. Albert brewed tea with the fussy patience of a man who knows the value of doing a small thing right. We sat by a low fire that sounded like the inside of an old violin when it is being tuned. "I've kept an eye on you," he said at last, not ashamed. At a distance. I knew enough to mind her solitude, but I never forgot my promise to Bruce. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask how he knew I was at that particular home. That answer would come later. For now, the only truth I could hold was that I was no longer beige. He set his cup down and looked at me over the rims of his glasses in a way that made me think of doctors and judges. "There's something else," he said slowly, as if the words were stones he needed to place carefully so they didn't break the table. "About Bruce. About the early days. We'll talk when you've slept." I didn't want to sleep. I slept anyway, the way people do when someone stands watch. In the morning, The light coming through Albert's kitchen window had color in it again. It spread over the countertop like a clean sheet. Jasper batted at a ray with the seriousness of a scholar. Albert cooked eggs like a man who respects chickens. Between bites, he told me what I would have to hear sooner or later. The story that would not replace betrayal but might loosen the knot it had tied in my chest. Years back, he said, when Bruce and I were trying every idea we could afford and 5 we couldn't, we put a little money into a small operation. Nothing fancy, not even paper with the right watermark. A handshake, a note. He never thought it would matter. I didn't either. It wasn't a proper share certificate, not really. More like a gentleman's marker, a participation that wouldn't appear in polite ledgers. We went on with our lives. The company struggled. Then the world changed, and it didn't. But that isn't the point I'm making. He paused there, and I realized his care with phrasing wasn't to build suspense for drama's sake. It was to make sure no word made a promise it couldn't keep. I've kept track of it from a distance, he continued. Not because I expected it to turn gold, but because I promised Bruce I would keep the thread in my hand. You know me. I hire a man when things need looking into. Once a year. Once every 2. Nothing intrusive. Just, is Miranda all right? Is Cole making good choices? Is the roof still holding? When I learned where you'd been taken, he stopped, breathed, and let a shadow pass over his face. I came. He did not yet speak about money because he understood what money can and cannot do. He did not call it inheritance because it would not be. He would call it something else later, something that did not rewrite the laws I still believed in. For the moment, all I needed was the knowledge that a man had remembered me when I had convinced myself I was forgettable. Jasper climbed my robe and sat in the crook of my elbow like a decision. Albert set his empty cup down, fingers steepled, and said, Miranda, we're going to put your life back in your name. Outside the window, the morning held still long enough for me to hear the sentence settle into the house. Albert's words echoed softly in the quiet kitchen, and for a moment, I didn't quite understand what they meant. Put your life back in your name. The phrase sounded like something poetic, not practical. I had lived too long under other people's decisions, Bruce's, then Cole's, then Victoria's, to imagine life could belong to me again. But Albert wasn't speaking in metaphors. Over the following days, he began gently putting the pieces of my old life back together. He started with the small things, a trip to buy clothes that actually fit me, a visit to a hairdresser where someone finally touched my head with care, and a stop at the vet for Jasper, who was declared healthy and full of mischief. It felt strange, being cared for without the shadow of obligation. I had forgotten that kindness could be quiet. Albert didn't press me about what came next. Instead, he let me breathe. I sat in the evenings by the window, with Jasper curled up on my lap, and listened to the soft ticking of the old clock in his living room. The world beyond the glass didn't feel as cruel as it had a week before. It was still unfamiliar, but it no longer seemed intent on swallowing me whole. Then, one morning over tea, Albert brought out an old wooden box. Inside were letters, neatly stacked, yellowed with age. Bruce and I started something together, he said, touching the top envelope. A long time ago, we built a small company, back when the two of us believed sweat and ideas could outrun luck. It wasn't big, but it became something, and it still exists. He handed me one of the letters. The paper trembled in my hands. It was a handwritten note from Bruce to Albert, dated decades ago, confirming a small share of their project. We agreed not to make this formal back then, Albert said. Bruce didn't want his name anywhere public. He worried about taxes, inspectors, everything he thought could take what we'd built. I nodded. That sounded like Bruce. Albert continued. I stayed involved over the years. It grew, slowly at first, then fast. I never forgot that part of it was his dream, too. And I've been saving something for you. It's not billions, Miranda, but it's enough to give you choices again. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a simple document transferring ownership of a modest trust to my name. I blinked, struggling to process the numbers. It wasn't a fortune, but it was stability. The kind I hadn't felt since Bruce died. Albert, I can't. He raised a hand. You can, because this isn't charity. This is Bruce's legacy finally landing where it should have a long time ago. Tears welled up before I could stop them. It wasn't about the money. It was about the gesture, the idea that someone had remembered me when I had become invisible. In the weeks that followed, Albert helped me find a small cottage on the outskirts of town. It wasn't fancy, but it had a fenced yard, a porch with peeling paint, and enough quiet to feel like peace. He helped me sign the lease in my name. My own name. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of a pen turn into power. When I moved in, I brought only what mattered: Jasper, a few photos, and the battered apron Victoria had refused to pack. Albert helped carry boxes inside, but when he saw me run my hand over the kitchen counter, already planning where I'd put the kettle, he quietly stepped outside to give me the moment alone. That night, as I made tea, I caught my reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman looking back. She wasn't the fragile figure Victoria had dismissed or the obedient wife who signed away a house for the sake of safety. She looked like someone who had weathered a storm and found land again. Albert visited often, never overstepping. He helped me fix the leaky faucet, set up an account for the trust, and even planted 2 small rose bushes in the yard for color. But what truly kept me grounded was something else entirely, something small, furry, and louder than he looked. Jasper. That kitten became the heartbeat of my new beginning. I took him to the vet, gave him proper food, and watched him grow from a fragile scrap into a confident little shadow who followed me everywhere. When I read at night, he'd curl around my ankle. When I gardened, he'd chase shadows on the fence. He became proof that what's abandoned can still thrive if given a second chance. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, pruning the roses Albert had planted, that an idea began to take root. I had always loved caring for small, helpless creatures. But what if I could do more than that? What if I could create a place, a real refuge for abandoned and mistreated animals? A small rescue, run properly, not cluttered like Victoria claimed, but organized, dignified, and safe. That night, I told Albert my idea over dinner. I want to start something, I said. A foundation. Not a big one, just enough to help animals the way I wish I could have helped myself years ago. Maybe it's foolish. Albert smiled. Miranda, that's the first sensible thing I've heard you say in a long time. We began planning the next day. He helped me find a small property on the edge of town, a converted barn with good land and access to the highway. I withdrew a portion of the trust to purchase it and spent the next month transforming the space. It started with a few kennels, some fencing, and a donation box near the gate. I painted the sign myself.
Second Chance Sanctuary.
The name came to me in a dream. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even particularly pretty at first, but it was alive. And soon, the sound of paws, feathers, and tiny claws replaced the hollow silence that had once lived in me. Local volunteers started coming by, students, retirees, even a few lonely souls who said they just wanted to feel useful. We took in stray cats, neglected dogs, and one particularly grumpy parrot who refused to say anything but out, out, out. I named him Cole, with a private sense of irony. I didn't seek publicity. I didn't want fame. But word spread anyway, as it tends to when good things quietly persist. Donations trickled in. A journalist wrote a small piece about us. Within a few months, Second Chances could afford proper enclosures and a vet visit twice a week. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar foundation, but it was a home. Albert visited often, bringing supplies and sitting with me on the porch as the sun set over the yard. He never once made me feel like I owed him anything. One evening, he said softly, "You realize Bruce would be proud, don't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. I wanted to believe that somewhere, Bruce could see me standing on my own feet again, surrounded by life instead of silence. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address made my stomach twist. Cole. I almost threw it away. I almost told myself I didn't need to open wounds that had barely started healing. But curiosity, old, stubborn, motherly curiosity won. The letter was short, Mom, I don't know where to start. Victoria left me. She said I was a fool for letting you go and took everything that wasn't nailed down. The house is half empty, and I finally understand what you meant when you said a home is built with love, not ownership. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to see you.
Please.
Cole. My hands trembled as I folded the letter. I didn't know what I felt.
Anger? Pity?
Relief? Maybe all of it at once. That night, I told Albert about the letter. He didn't tell me what to do. He simply said, "You'll know when you're ready." It took me 2 weeks. When Cole finally appeared at the gates of Second Chances, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in spirit. His shoulders hunched, his eyes dull, his confidence gone. He wasn't the man who had once shouted at me in my own living room. He was a boy again, one who'd lost the script he'd been performing. "Mom," he said quietly, gripping the fence like it might keep him from falling. I was wrong. I looked at him for a long time. The sanctuary behind me buzzed with life. Dogs barking, birds chattering, wind rustling through leaves. Everything I'd built stood between us, a living monument to the choice I had been forced to make. "Do you know what you said to me that day?" I asked. He nodded.
Ida.
I replay it every night. And
I'm sorry.
I was blinded. Victoria made me believe I had to choose her or lose everything. Turns out, I lost both. I watched him crumble in front of me. For years, I had imagined this moment, me strong, him remorseful. But now that it was here, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy. I opened the gate. "Come in," I said. He hesitated. "You're not angry." "Oh, I am," I said softly. "But I've learned that anger doesn't rebuild what's broken. Work does." He stepped inside. Jasper, now full-grown, twined around his ankles as if performing a silent test. Cole knelt down, and for the first time, I saw genuine humility in his eyes. "Does he always greet people like that?" "No," I said. "Just the ones he's willing to give another chance." Cole looked up, his voice cracking. "What can I do, Mom? How can I even start to make this right?" I took a deep breath. Behind me, the dogs barked, the cats meowed, and life went on. "You can start," I said, "by helping here. Not as my son, but as a worker. Cleaning, feeding, fixing. We don't have hierarchies here, just responsibility." He blinked, surprised, but then nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." I handed him a pair of old work gloves. "Then let's see if you can build something instead of breaking it." Albert, who had been watching from the porch, smiled quietly into his tea. That was how redemption began. Not with grand gestures or apologies too late to matter, but with small acts of service, repeated every day until they meant something. Cole worked hard. He showed up before sunrise, shoveled, cleaned cages, repaired fences. The animals learned his scent and stopped shying away. He learned their names, their quirks. And little by little, I saw traces of the boy I used to know, hidden beneath layers of pride and fear. Months passed.
Second Chance thrived.
Albert's health began to falter, but he still visited, leaning on his cane, content to watch what he had helped nurture. Before his last visit, he told me quietly, "You've done what few people ever manage. You turned pain into purpose." When he passed away, I named the new wing of the sanctuary after him, the Dempsey Haven. It was a simple wooden plaque, but it carried everything words couldn't say. Sometimes, when I walk through the sanctuary at dusk, I see Cole playing fetch with the dogs, Jasper perched on the fence watching over us. The air smells of hay and rain, and for a moment, I think of Bruce, of the home we built, the mistakes we made, and the strange, winding road that led me here. I'm not the woman who once begged to stay in her own house. I'm the woman who built a new one, with open doors, second chances, and peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's permission. Cole settled into work at Second Chances the way a man learns to walk again after a long illness, slowly, with visible effort and clumsy grace. The first morning, he arrived before sunrise, his car headlights cutting through the early mist that hung over the fields. I watched from the porch as he stood for a while, unsure where to begin, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, eyes searching for permission. I handed him a bucket and pointed toward the kennels. "The dogs eat before we do," I said. He nodded and went to work without complaint. It was strange, seeing my son like that, bent over, scooping food, coaxing frightened strays into calmness. I had expected him to quit after a day or two, to find the work beneath him. But he stayed. He came back the next day, and the next, sometimes even on Sundays when no one asked him to. At first, he barely spoke. We worked side by side in companionable silence, interrupted only by the clatter of food bowls and the rustle of hay. But over time, small conversations began to form, like timid shoots pushing through winter soil. "Remember when Dad made me feed the neighbor's chickens?" he said one morning. "I hated it." "You were scared of the rooster," I replied. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck.
Yeah.
"Guess I'm making up for it now." There was warmth in his voice, the kind I hadn't heard in years. Albert's absence left a quiet ache around the sanctuary after his passing. He had been the glue that steadied the in-between moments, when I doubted myself or when the bills piled higher than I liked. In his will, he left a modest sum for Miranda's sanctuary and continued stubbornness, as he phrased it. Enough to finish a small expansion, new kennels, a fenced play area, and a wooden bench overlooking the field. I had the carpenter carve Albert's view into the backrest. Every evening, I sat there with Jasper on my lap, watching the sunset bleed into the hills, and whispered my thanks to the man who had helped me reclaim my name. Cole often joined me, still in his work clothes, his hands calloused and his hair dusted with straw. Sometimes he'd bring tea. Sometimes he'd just sit quietly, both of us staring at the same sky that had once separated us. He was changing, and not just on the surface. The arrogance had drained out of him, replaced by something fragile but real: humility. One afternoon, I caught him kneeling beside an old hound with cataracts, whispering to it softly. The dog wagged its tail weakly, pressing its head into his hands. "You talk to them like they understand," I said. "They do," he answered simply. "They just don't interrupt." I smiled. "You're learning." He looked up at me, eyes tired but clear. I wish I had learned sooner. There were moments when his old guilt came through, quiet apologies woven into everyday gestures. He'd fix a broken latch without being asked or bring groceries I hadn't mentioned needing. One morning, I found a new kettle on my stove with a note, for tea, like Albert used to make. Forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a long road paved with the small stones of daily decency. Months passed like this, and with each one, the sanctuary grew, not in grandeur, but in life. Local schools began visiting. Volunteers painted murals of rescued animals on the barn walls. A retired carpenter built birdhouses for the trees. The place had a pulse that echoed through everyone who entered. Then, one chilly morning in late autumn, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, deliberate. When I saw the name on the envelope, my stomach tightened. Victoria. I nearly tore it in half, but curiosity, that dangerous old flame, made me open it. "Miranda, I suppose you've heard that I left Cole. I doubt you care, and I can't blame you. But I wanted you to know something. I regret nothing about my choices, only that I underestimated you. I thought you'd fade quietly, like old wallpaper. Instead, you've turned into some kind of local saint, rescuing animals and forgiving people who don't deserve it. How poetic. Don't worry, I'm not asking for anything. Just wanted to let you know that the house you built, the one in Cole's name, is finally on the market. Seems fitting that what began as your dream ends as someone else's investment. Sincerely, Victoria." I read it twice. There was no venom left in me for her, only a hollow amusement at her need to have the last word. I folded the letter and tossed it into the fireplace. The flames took it without ceremony. When I told Cole later, he looked pained. "She's selling it? Without even telling me?" "You let her," I said gently. "You gave her permission to decide your worth. Now you get to decide differently." He lowered his eyes. I'd buy it back if I could. You don't need to, I said. You're already building something better here. Still, something about that conversation lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked outside, the moon silvering the fields, and realized that closure wasn't about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about releasing what no longer served you. The house I had built with Bruce was gone in every way that mattered. But in the barn where rescue dogs snored softly, where Jasper chased moths under the porch light, where my son worked by choice, not duty, I had built another home. Winter came, and with it a new rhythm. Cole had earned the respect of every volunteer. They called him the quiet one, but they followed his lead. He never asked for recognition, never tried to erase the past. That was how I knew his remorse was real. On Christmas morning, I found him repairing the old fence near the back field, breath fogging in the cold air. When he saw me, he smiled shyly. "I got something for you," he said, handing me a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate pendant, silver, shaped like a paw print, with the engraving, "For every life you saved, including mine." I didn't cry immediately. I waited until I was alone. The holidays passed quietly. Life found its balance again. Then, one afternoon in early spring, a black sedan pulled up to the sanctuary gate. A well-dressed man stepped out and introduced himself as a real estate broker. "Mrs. Gardner?" he asked. "I'm here on behalf of a client interested in donating property to your foundation."
It's
Quite a unique offer. I frowned. "You must be mistaken. We're just a small local sanctuary." He smiled politely. "Not a mistake, ma'am. The client asked me to tell you that he was moved by what you've built here and that you once owned this particular property yourself." He handed me the papers. My breath caught when I saw the address. The house. My old home. Cole stepped up beside me, eyes wide. "Mom, is that?" "Yes," I whispered. "It is." The broker explained that an anonymous buyer had purchased it outright and requested that ownership be transferred to Second Chance's sanctuary. The only condition was that it never be sold again. I didn't need to guess who the donor was. The handwriting on the final signature line, AD, was as familiar as sunlight on the porch of memory. Albert. Even from beyond this world, he had found one last way to keep his promise. Tears filled my eyes as I signed the acceptance documents. Cole placed his hand gently on mine. "Mom," he said, voice trembling, "maybe it's time we went back, just once." We drove there the next morning. The drive was shorter than I remembered, maybe because I was no longer carrying the same weight. The house looked different. Freshly painted, new shutters, but the bones were the same. I walked through each room slowly, letting the memories rise and dissolve like fog. In the living room, I paused where the old armchair used to be, the one Victoria had exiled to the garage. The sunlight hit the wall just the same way it used to when Bruce would nap there on Sundays. For the first time in years, the sight didn't hurt. Cole stood beside me, silent. Finally, he said, "I was so blind. I thought being a man meant taking control. Turns out it means knowing when to protect what matters." "You learned," I said softly. "That's what matters now." He looked at me then, eyes shining. "Can we keep this place as part of the sanctuary? Maybe for rehabilitation or adoptions?" I smiled. "That's exactly what we'll do." And we did. We converted the house into a small adoption center and shelter extension. The front yard became a play space for visiting families and their soon-to-be pets. Inside, we hung photographs of every animal Second Chances had saved. The final photo we hung was of Albert, smiling with Jasper perched on his lap. It took months to finish, but when it opened, people came from all over town. Reporters wrote kind words. Donations increased. More importantly, hearts healed. Mine, Cole's, and even those of the creatures we saved. Sometimes, life gives you justice that doesn't look like revenge. It looks like peace. 2 years passed. The sanctuary had grown, not into something large, but into something lasting. The wooden sign at the entrance, Second Chance's Sanctuary, had weathered under the sun, its paint fading just enough to look timeless. We had added 3 small cottages for volunteers and visiting vets, and the old house, my old house, had become our adoption center. Children now ran through the same garden where I once grew herbs, laughing as rescued dogs bounded beside them. Every wall that once held silence now echoed with life. Cole was no longer just a helper. He had become the heart of the place. The volunteers looked to him for guidance. The animals trusted his voice, and the community began to associate his name with kindness instead of arrogance. He refused titles, though. Whenever someone called him the director, he corrected them gently.
No.
I just work here like everyone else. It was humbling to watch the transformation. I had seen my son as a child, a man, a stranger, and now, finally, as a soul at peace with himself. He and I developed our own rhythm again. He came to my cottage every evening with tea and stories from the day, which cat had given birth, which dog had escaped its pen, which donor had stopped by. Jasper, aging but proud, always curled between us. Life had softened around the edges, the way it does after years of touch. But healing never happens in silence alone. It happens in purpose. That was something Albert used to say, and every day proved him right. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, Cole came to me holding a stack of letters. "These came for you," he said, "from people in town." I opened them one by one. Notes from strangers, handwritten, heartfelt. "Your sanctuary saved my dog after the flood. My daughter volunteered last summer and hasn't stopped smiling since. Thank you for reminding us that kindness still exists." I didn't realize I was crying until Cole handed me a handkerchief. "You started something, Mom," he said softly. "You didn't just save animals, you saved people like me, who forgot how to care." I squeezed his hand.
No, son.
We did. Spring arrived again, carrying the scent of new beginnings. The sanctuary bloomed with color, and for the first time, we hosted a small community event, the Day of Second Chances. Families came to adopt, volunteers set up tables with lemonade and crafts, and I gave a short speech, reluctantly but sincerely. I stood on the porch of the old house, sunlight spilling across the yard. Cole was beside me, Jasper at my feet. Most of us, I began, go through life believing we only get one chance. But I've learned that sometimes it takes losing everything to find what was meant for you. I once thought home was a place. Now I know it's the people and hearts we choose to care for, again and again. The crowd clapped, and for a brief moment, I caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the field, a woman in a pale coat, watching silently. When I blinked, she was gone. Maybe it was just my imagination. Or maybe it was Victoria, drawn by the sound of laughter she couldn't destroy. Either way, it didn't matter. Years continued their gentle march. Cole eventually took over most of the daily work, though he insisted I stay involved. "The sanctuary needs your touch," he'd say. "I just keep the wheels turning." He met someone, a kind woman named Leah, a vet who volunteered one summer and never quite left. She was steady and strong, the kind of person who didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. When they married, they held the ceremony right there in the sanctuary garden. Instead of confetti, volunteers released doves and butterflies. Instead of gifts, guests donated to the animals. During the vows, Cole looked at me, tears shining in his eyes, and said, "If it weren't for my mother, I wouldn't know what love is." And in that moment, every wound, every scar, every night I thought I had failed as a mother turned into light. As the years passed, I grew older but never lonely. The sanctuary remained full of life, laughter, barking, and the constant rhythm of care. When the mornings grew colder and my hands ached, Cole would take over the heavier chores, but he always left me small tasks: bottle feeding the kittens, brushing the old dogs, watering the roses Albert had planted. One afternoon, I sat on the bench by Albert's view with Jasper beside me, his fur now gray like mine. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold. Cole walked up and sat next to me without a word. For a while, we just watched the horizon. You ever think about what comes next? He asked quietly. I used to, I said. Now I just trust that what's meant to continue will find its way. He nodded slowly, then smiled. That's exactly what you've built here, a way for good things to continue. When Jasper passed away in his sleep a few weeks later, we buried him under the oak tree near the sanctuary gate. I placed a small stone there, engraved with the words, "The first second chance." I didn't weep like before. I smiled through the tears, knowing that love doesn't end. It only changes form. Cole found me later that evening, still sitting under the tree. He placed his arm around my shoulders. He had a good life, he said. We all did, I whispered. As the sanctuary continued to grow, Cole and Leah expanded it into a registered foundation, still modest, still humble, but steady. They called it the Gardner Foundation for Second Chances, though I told them it was far too grand a name for something built on casseroles and elbow grease. But secretly, it made my heart swell. Schools brought children for visits. Local shelters partnered with us. The town held fundraisers every spring. And every year, during the anniversary of the sanctuary's founding, Cole gave a short speech, always ending with the same line. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering and choosing to love anyway. He'd glance at me as he said it, and I'd nod, knowing he finally understood. One evening, as twilight settled, I found myself sitting by the fireplace in my cottage, flipping through an old photo album. Pictures of Bruce, of Albert, of the early days. The laughter frozen in those images felt close, like a warm hand on my shoulder. I closed the book and looked around the room. Every object had a story. The teacup from Albert's kitchen. The quilt I had once packed in a suitcase. The wooden paw print pendant Cole had given me years ago. Life had come full circle, but instead of trapping me, it had freed me. Outside, I could hear the faint sounds of the sanctuary, the bark of a dog, the call of an owl, the distant murmur of voices. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and smiled. For the first time in a lifetime, peace didn't feel like an accident. It felt earned. And that's when I realized something profound. The moment my son shouted at me to leave his house, he unknowingly set me free. Because sometimes life has to break you, loudly, brutally, unapologetically, so you finally remember that your soul was never meant to live in a cage. Years later, after I was gone, Cole kept everything running. He turned my cottage into a small museum, photos, journals, and a plaque at the entrance that read, Miranda Gardner, founder of Second Chances Sanctuary, because everyone deserves to be loved twice. Visitors often left flowers by the oak tree where Jasper rested. And every spring, when the first roses bloomed, Cole would sit on Albert's view with a cup of tea and whisper, "We did it, Mom." And in the rustling leaves, in the soft bark of distant dogs, in the hum of the sanctuary alive with purpose, he could always feel my answer.